Ethan Carter stood in his backyard, coffee in hand, surveying the perfectly manicured lawn with a mix of satisfaction and unease. The yard was immaculate. Rows of blooming hydrangeas bordered the walkway, and the flower beds were bursting with vibrant colors. But it wasn't his work, and that nagged at him. The property, like the house itself, had been curated to perfection by the previous owners. Ethan and Chloe had moved into Maple Ridge just 3 months ago, leaving behind a modest house in the suburbs. This was their dream home, a 5-bedroom craftsman with tall windows, a wraparound porch, and a detached studio for Chloe's art. To Ethan, it symbolized success. 20 years in the tech industry, long hours, and late nights, all paying off. He wanted everything here to reflect the life he'd built. Everything had to stay perfect. That's when he saw him, a man crouched near the rose bushes, pruning the stems with hand shears. He wasn't part of the landscaping crew Ethan had hired to maintain the property. This man worked alone, his cart of tools small and unbranded. Dressed in a worn flannel shirt and sturdy work pants, he seemed out of place amidst the upscale charm of Maple Ridge. Ethan sipped his coffee, watching. The man's movements were meticulous, almost reverent. Each cut revealed a hidden order within the branches. But why was he here? Ethan hadn't hired anyone new. Chloe's voice broke through his thoughts. Admiring the yard again? She stood in the doorway, a playful smile on her face. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and her hands were streaked with paint from her morning in the studio. Not exactly, Ethan replied. There's a new gardener out there. I didn't hire him. Chloe stepped outside, squinting toward the rose bushes. Well, he's doing a great job. The roses haven't looked this good since we moved in. That's not the point, Ethan said, frowning. He shouldn't be here without my permission. Chloe gave him a teasing nudge. Maybe he's a gift from the landscaping gods. Don't overthink it. Ethan spent the rest of the day focused on work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the mysterious gardener. That evening, during dinner, he brought it up again. I think I'll ask the landscapers who this guy is, Ethan said, twirling his fork in his pasta. Why not just ask him directly? Chloe suggested. He's probably just filling in for someone else. Their teenage daughter, Maya, chimed in, not looking up from her phone. Why do you care so much? The yard looks amazing. It's not about the yard, Ethan said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. It's about boundaries. If someone's working on my property, I have a right to know who they are. Chloe gave him a knowing look. Maybe he knows the property better than you think. The comment lingered in Ethan's mind long after dinner. He decided that tomorrow, he would confront the man and establish some ground rules. The following morning, Ethan stood at the kitchen window, waiting for the gardener to arrive. Sure enough, at precisely 8 a.m., the man wheeled his cart up the driveway. Nodding politely at a passing neighbor, Ethan took a deep breath, adjusted his watch, and stepped outside. The man was crouched near the hydrangeas, carefully removing wilted blossoms. Ethan cleared his throat. Excuse me. The man looked up, his face calm and weathered, with eyes that seemed to hold decades of experience. He stood slowly, brushing soil off his hands. Good morning, the man said, his voice deep and steady. Can I help you with something? I'm Ethan Carter, Ethan said, extending his hand. I'm the homeowner. The man shook his hand firmly. Samuel Hayes, nice to meet you. I wasn't aware of any changes to the landscaping crew. Ethan began. I like to be informed about who's working on my property. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. I've been tending to this yard for quite some time, Mr. Carter, long before you moved in. Ethan frowned. I see. Well, I'd appreciate it if you ran any changes by me first. I like to stay involved. Samuel tilted his head slightly, as if considering Ethan's words. Of course, he said simply, though some changes are best left to the land itself. The cryptic response caught Ethan off guard. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss. Before he could regain his footing, Samuel had already turned back to his work. Later that day, Ethan brought up the interaction to Chloe while she painted in her studio. The guy's different, he said, pacing near the window. He talks like he owns the place. Chloe glanced up from her canvas, her brush poised mid-stroke. Maybe he does. In a way, he clearly knows what he's doing. That's not the point, Ethan said, his frustration rising again. It's about respect. He didn't even ask before making changes. Chloe shrugged. Maybe he doesn't see it that way. You should give him a chance. Ethan frowned, unwilling to admit that she might have a point. Still, the exchange with Samuel gnawed at him. There was something about the man's quiet confidence that felt like a challenge. The following weekend, Ethan found himself chatting with their neighbor, Margaret Jones. She was in her 70s, with a sharp wit and a knack for storytelling. As they talked about the neighborhood, Ethan mentioned Samuel. "Ah, Samuel Hayes," Margaret said with a knowing smile. "He's a legend around here." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Legend? He's the original owner of your property," Margaret explained. "Built it himself, along with half the houses on this block. He's an architect, you know, retired now, but he still takes care of the properties he's sold. Says it keeps him connected." Ethan stared at her, stunned. "He used to own my house?" Margaret chuckled. "Oh, yes. Samuel's been here for decades. He only sells to people he thinks will take care of the land." "Guess he saw something in you." Ethan's face flushed with embarrassment. He had been so quick to assert his authority. And all along, Samuel had been the true steward of the property. Ethan returned home that evening, his mind swirling with Margaret's revelation. He stood at the edge of the garden, staring at the perfectly pruned hydrangeas Samuel had tended to earlier. The thought that Samuel Hayes, the man he had treated as just another hired hand, was not only the original owner of the house but also a respected architect, filled him with a growing sense of shame. The next morning, Ethan couldn't bring himself to watch Samuel work from the kitchen window. Instead, he paced in his home office, glancing occasionally at his email inbox but unable to focus on the day's tasks. Around mid-morning, he made a decision. "I need to talk to him," Ethan muttered to himself. He stepped outside, his shoes crunching on the gravel walkway as he approached Samuel, who was kneeling near a cluster of lavender plants. "Good morning," Ethan said, his voice hesitant. Samuel glanced up and gave a polite nod. "Morning, Mr. Carter." Ethan shifted awkwardly, clearing his throat. I spoke with Margaret Jones yesterday. She told me about you, about your history with this property." Samuel's hands paused over the soil, but he didn't look up. "Ah, Margaret," he said after a moment. "She does like to talk." Ethan forced a weak chuckle. "She mentioned that you built this house. I didn't realize." Samuel finally met Ethan's gaze, his expression calm but unreadable. "What didn't you realize? That you're not just a gardener." Ethan winced inwardly at his choice of words. Samuel stood slowly, brushing the dirt off his hands. "I've never thought of myself as just anything," he said. "I care for this land because it's part of me, not because of titles or roles." Ethan's cheeks burned. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I've been judgmental. I made assumptions about you. And I was wrong." Samuel studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Acknowledging a mistake is the first step toward fixing it. Ethan felt a surprising weight lift from his chest. He had expected anger or indifference, but Samuel's calm acceptance was somehow more humbling. "I'd like to understand more about what you're doing here," Ethan added, "if you're willing to teach me." Samuel's lips quirked into the faintest hint of a smile. "Gardening isn't just about plants, Mr. Carter. It's about patience, observation, and respect for the land and for yourself. If you're ready to learn that, I'm happy to share what I know." The following Saturday morning, Ethan joined Samuel in the garden. At first, he felt out of place, awkwardly crouching in the dirt while Samuel worked with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades in tune with the land. But as the hours passed, Ethan found himself absorbed in the process. "These plants," Samuel said, gesturing to a patch of wildflowers, "came from seeds I scattered years ago. They thrive because they've adapted to the soil here. No amount of fertilizer or watering can replace what nature does best on its own." Ethan nodded, his hands deep in the soil as he helped dig a new bed for spring bulbs. "It's like starting a business," he said, surprising himself. "You can't force growth. You have to let things develop naturally, based on their strengths." Samuel's eyes crinkled in amusement. "Exactly. Nature is the greatest teacher, if you're willing to listen." For the first time, Ethan felt a sense of peace as he worked. The garden, once just a symbol of his success, was becoming something far more meaningful, a space of connection and reflection. As the weeks passed, Ethan began to notice changes, not just in the garden, but in himself. He stopped watching Samuel from the window, choosing instead to join him whenever time allowed. Their conversations ranged from gardening techniques to broader philosophies about life, success, and the importance of community. Ethan's growing interest didn't go unnoticed by his family. Chloe often joined them, offering her artistic eye for design, while Maya began asking Samuel questions about sustainable landscaping for a school project. "You're becoming quite the gardener, Dad," Maya teased one afternoon. "Never thought I'd see the day." Ethan laughed, wiping dirt from his hands. "Neither did I, but it's surprisingly satisfying." Around this time, the Maple Ridge Neighborhood Association announced plans for a community garden. Margaret, who chaired the committee, approached Ethan at one of their meetings. "You seem to have a knack for this now," she said with a wink. "Why don't you and Samuel take the lead on this project?" Ethan hesitated. The idea of working on something so public made him nervous. But when he mentioned it to Samuel, the older man's enthusiasm was contagious. "A community garden isn't just about growing vegetables," Samuel said. "It's about growing connections. People come together over shared work, and they leave with a better understanding of each other." Ethan agreed, and over the next few months, he and Samuel became the driving force behind the project. They rallied neighbors, secured funding, and designed a layout that balanced practicality with beauty. The process was challenging, but it brought Ethan a new sense of purpose. By the time spring arrived, the community garden was thriving. Families gathered to plant vegetables and flowers. Children played in the shaded corners, and neighbors who had barely spoken before now shared laughs over watering cans. Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment as he watched the garden flourish. It wasn't just a collection of plants, it was a testament to what could be achieved when people came together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and Samuel stood at the edge of the garden, surveying their work. "You've come a long way, Mr. Carter," Samuel said, his voice tinged with pride. "This place wouldn't be what it is without your vision." Ethan shook his head. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. You taught me to see things differently, to appreciate what really matters." Samuel smiled. "That's the thing about growth. It's not just the plants that change." The transformation of Ethan Carter wasn't just limited to the garden. As he began spending more time with Samuel and the community garden project, the way he approached his life, his family, his career, and even himself, started to shift. At work, Ethan had always been known as a no-nonsense leader, someone who valued results above all else. But now, he found himself paying more attention to his team. During a weekly meeting, he noticed one of the junior developers, Carla, hesitating to share her ideas. "Carla," Ethan said, his tone encouraging, "what do you think? I'd love to hear your perspective." Surprised, Carla looked up, then slowly explained her suggestion for streamlining one of their key workflows. As she spoke, Ethan saw the confidence grow in her expression. "That's a great idea," he said, nodding. "Let's explore it further." After the meeting, Carla approached him. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I wasn't sure anyone would listen." Ethan smiled. "Good ideas can come from anyone, Carla. Sometimes we just need to make space for them." He hadn't realized how much Samuel's lessons were bleeding into his work life. But he welcomed the change. It wasn't just about delegating tasks anymore, it was about nurturing growth. Just like in the garden. Back in Maple Ridge, the community garden became the heart of the neighborhood. On weekends, families gathered to tend their plots, sharing gardening tips and swapping recipes. Ethan had never been one for small talk, but now he found himself enjoying these interactions. Maya, too, had taken a keen interest in the project. She began volunteering after school, helping younger children learn to plant seeds and care for their flowers. One afternoon, as Ethan and Maya worked side by side planting sunflowers, she looked up at him and said, "You've changed, Dad." Ethan paused, his hands deep in the soil. "Changed how?" "You're softer," Maya said with a grin. "In a good way. You're actually listening to people." Ethan laughed. "Well, sometimes it takes someone like Samuel to show you what really matters." Maya tilted her head, a thoughtful look crossing her face. "Do you think I could learn from him too?" "I think anyone could," Ethan replied. The next time Samuel visited the Carter household, Maya asked if she could join him in the garden. Samuel, always patient and welcoming, agreed immediately. Over the weeks that followed, Maya and Samuel developed a mentor-student relationship. Samuel taught her not just about plants but about the deeper philosophies of gardening, how it mirrored life, with its cycles of growth, decay, and renewal. One afternoon, as they worked together, Samuel said, "You know, Maya, you remind me of someone I used to know." "Who?" Maya asked, curious. "My daughter," Samuel said, his voice tinged with emotion. "She passed away many years ago. But she had the same curiosity, the same spark." Maya looked up, her face soft with understanding. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes." Samuel gave her a small smile. "Thank you. But working with you, with your dad, with this whole neighborhood, it reminds me that growth never really stops. Life finds a way to keep moving forward." As summer approached, the community garden was thriving, and the neighborhood decided to host a garden party to celebrate. Ethan and Chloe offered to host the event in their backyard, blending the beauty of their home's landscaping with the charm of the community project. The day of the party was warm and sunny, with tables set up under the shade of maple trees. Neighbors brought food and drinks, and laughter filled the air as children ran between the flower beds. Ethan stood with Samuel near the hydrangeas, watching the scene unfold. "I never imagined this when I first moved here," Ethan admitted. "I thought success was about having the perfect house, the perfect lawn, but this feels better." Samuel nodded, his hands resting on his tool belt. "Success isn't about what you own, Ethan. It's about what you build, relationships, trust, community. That's what lasts." The garden party marked a turning point for Ethan. He started seeing himself not just as a homeowner or a businessman, but as a member of a larger community. He became more involved in Maple Ridge's activities, even joining the neighborhood association. Meanwhile, Maya decided to pursue environmental design in college. Inspired by her time with Samuel, she and Samuel worked together on a new section of the community garden, planting native wildflowers to attract pollinators. One afternoon, as they finished their work, Maya turned to Samuel. "Do you ever regret selling this house?" she asked. Samuel shook his head. "Not at all. It's not the house that matters, it's the people who live in it. And I think your family is exactly what this place needed." On a crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after their first encounter, Ethan stood in his backyard, looking at the garden. The flowers were fading, their bright colors giving way to the warm hues of fall. But the beauty was still there, in the textures of the leaves and the gentle sway of ornamental grasses in the breeze. Samuel arrived a few minutes later, his cart of tools in tow. "Ready to prepare for winter?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Let's do it." As they worked together, Ethan reflected on how much had changed. The garden wasn't just a part of his property anymore, it was a part of him. A living testament to the lessons he'd learned from Samuel. When they finished for the day, Ethan turned to Samuel. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for teaching me how to see things differently." Samuel smiled, his expression warm. "Thank you, Ethan, for being willing to learn." As Samuel wheeled his cart down the driveway, Ethan watched him go, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He knew now that the garden, like life, was always a work in progress, and he was ready to keep growing. Ethan Carter found himself reflecting on the past year more frequently than ever. The garden that once symbolized his success had transformed into a metaphor for something much larger. It wasn't just about tending to plants, it was about cultivating relationships, understanding, and humility. His newfound approach to life extended into his workplace, where he had introduced a mentorship program for junior employees. Inspired by Samuel's guidance, Ethan began spending time with his team, listening more than speaking, and fostering an environment where ideas and growth flourished. One afternoon, as he prepared for a company-wide meeting, Ethan received an unexpected email from his team. They had nominated him for an internal leadership award, citing his inspiring mentorship and transformative leadership style. Ethan stared at the screen, momentarily speechless. It wasn't the recognition that moved him but the realization of how much his approach had changed. He thought back to Samuel's words, "Success isn't about what you own. It's about what you build." At Maple Ridge, the community garden continued to thrive, drawing in more neighbors each month. It had become a hub of activity, with weekend workshops, seasonal planting events, and even a small farmer's market. Samuel remained the heart of it all, his wisdom and quiet leadership inspiring everyone around him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan invited Samuel and Margaret to dinner at his home. They sat on the wraparound porch, enjoying Chloe's homemade pie and sharing stories of the neighborhood's history. "Samuel," Ethan said, leaning forward, "have you ever thought about writing a book? Your experience, your philosophy, it could inspire so many people." Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "I've always been a man of action, Ethan. Words are powerful, but I prefer to let my work speak for itself." Margaret interjected with a sly smile. "But your work has inspired a lot of people. Samuel, you've built more than homes and gardens, you've built a community." Samuel seemed to consider this, his gaze thoughtful. "Perhaps," he said after a moment. "But my greatest satisfaction comes from seeing others carry that forward. People like you, Ethan, and Maya, that's my legacy." Maya's passion for environmental design had grown into a calling. With Samuel's guidance, she had developed a proposal for a sustainable landscaping initiative in Maple Ridge. The idea was simple: to replace underutilized green spaces with native plants and community gardens that supported local ecosystems. She presented her plan at a neighborhood meeting, her voice steady but filled with excitement. "This isn't just about making the neighborhood look better," she said. "It's about creating spaces that bring people together, that give back to the environment." The proposal was met with unanimous enthusiasm, and Maya was thrilled when the neighborhood association approved the project. Samuel and Ethan both volunteered to help her lead it. As they worked together, Ethan felt an immense pride in his daughter. Watching her follow her passion reminded him of how far their family had come since moving to Maple Ridge. With the arrival of winter, the gardens in Maple Ridge settled into their quiet phase. The flowers had wilted, the vegetable plots lay dormant, and a thin layer of frost blanketed the soil. But the sense of community remained vibrant. One frosty morning, Ethan joined Samuel at the community garden to prepare it for the colder months. They worked side by side, mulching beds and insulating young plants. The air was crisp, their breath visible as they spoke. "You've come a long way, Ethan," Samuel said, his voice warm. "I remember the man who stood at his window, watching me work with suspicion." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "And I remember the man who didn't hesitate to put me in my place, without saying much of anything." Samuel grinned. "Sometimes, the best lessons are learned in silence." They paused, gazing at the garden they had nurtured together. The bare trees and empty beds held the promise of renewal in the spring. By the time spring returned, the community garden and Ethan's own yard were bursting with life. The bulbs Samuel had planted months earlier bloomed in perfect harmony, creating a cascade of color that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. The Sustainable Landscaping Initiative led by Maya had transformed Maple Ridge. Neighbors worked together to care for shared spaces, and the bonds between families had grown stronger. The neighborhood had become a model of collaboration and environmental stewardship. On a warm afternoon, Ethan stood with Samuel at the edge of the garden, watching the sunflowers sway gently in the breeze. "I used to think the most important thing I'd ever build was my company," Ethan said, "but now I realize, it's this. The relationships, the lessons, the community." Samuel nodded, his expression content, "And it's a legacy that will keep growing long after we're gone." One day, several months later, Ethan received a handwritten letter in the mail. The envelope bore Samuel's neat script, and inside was a simple note. "Dear Ethan, I wanted to thank you for listening, for learning, and for carrying forward what we've built together. You've taught me that growth is a two-way street. Just as I've guided you, you've reminded me of the power of hope and renewal. Keep growing, my friend, Samuel." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as he read the words. He placed the letter in a frame, setting it on his desk as a daily reminder of the lessons Samuel had taught him. Years later, Ethan would look back on his time in Maple Ridge as the most transformative period of his life. He had built more than just a garden, he had built a life rooted in connection, humility, and purpose. On a quiet evening, he stood in his yard, now filled with vibrant blooms and buzzing with life. Maya, now a landscape architect, was working on her latest project in the community garden. Chloe sat on the porch, sketching a new piece inspired by the flowers around her. Ethan closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of fresh earth and blooming lavender. The garden was never finished, but that was the beauty of it. There was always more to tend, more to nurture, more to grow. And as he watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting the garden in a golden glow. He smiled. Life, like the garden, was a continuous work in progress. And he was grateful to be part of it. As the sun sets on Ethan Carter's journey, we're reminded that true growth isn't just about what we build, it's about the relationships we nurture, the lessons we learn, and the ways we open our hearts to change. Through the wisdom of Samuel Hayes, Ethan discovered the beauty of humility, community, and connection. This story isn't just about a garden, it's about life. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most transformative lessons come from the simplest acts. Like digging into the soil, working side by side, and choosing to see the world through someone else's eyes. What did you think of Ethan's journey? Did it inspire you to reflect on your own relationships or how you view success? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the story. Hit that subscribe button to join us for more inspiring stories about personal growth, connection, and transformation. And make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Thank you for being a part of our community. And we'll see you in the next story. Remember, life, like a garden, is always a work in progress. Keep growing, keep learning, and keep connecting.